Good afternoon if you're in the UK or Europe, good evening in Asia, and good morning in North America. Thank you very, very much for joining us for today's talk. So today we're very, very happy and fortunate to welcome Professor Ian Chong of the National University of Singapore. He's an expert on both Chinese politics and politics of Southeast Asia, and also works very, very interestingly at the intersection between international relations and comparative politics, often in a historically and area studies inflected way. So exactly in line with what we in the center like to emphasize across the board. He completed his undergraduate degree at Georgetown and his master's and PhD at Princeton, finishing in 2008. And then in 2012, published an award-winning book on international intervention and the politics of state formation in China, Indonesia, and Thailand. And in addition to that, he's published a slews and slews of interesting articles, held all kinds of prestigious and interesting grants and fellowships in several different countries. And so today he's going to talk to us about this somewhat contentious sounding topic, but actually rather timely as well, stand up like a Taiwanese, PRC coercion and its effects, I think, on Taiwan politics and the limits of the utility of coercion. So with that, I'll invite him to speak for as long as he likes about this topic, and then afterwards we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So
Thank you so much, Bill. And I'm grateful to the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here and to speak with all of you online. Although I think Bill very dangerously said I can speak for as long as I'd like. I wouldn't want to hear myself with that. But with that having been said, let's begin. Let me start sharing my slides. I hope this works. So you should be seeing my slides right now. So what I'm here to speak about today is really about the effects and limits to coercion, coercive diplomacy, if you like, economic statecraft, if some prefer. And I look specifically at the case of Taiwan because it is the subject of quite a bit of coercive pressure from the PRC. So I suppose in some respects, Taiwan provides a little bit of a snapshot to how entities might respond to economic pressure. So I'll quickly go through the sort of overview that I have, which I've started already. I'll talk about some of the puzzles that come out from looking at coercive diplomacy. I'll go through my hypotheses quite quickly, then talk about the evidence implications before drawing things to a close. That's the general plan for this afternoon. So I guess as I had mentioned, what I'm really looking at is the question of public responses to economic coercion. And empirically, right, what we see is that there has been increased PRC coercion towards Taiwan. Especially since 2016, you see economic restrictions such as on fruits, you see limits of tourism, there's diplomatic pressure. So it's not just the economic bits, right? So there's diplomatic pressure, further trying to isolate Taiwan from international participation. There's the military intimidation bits, which we see from the increasingly regular flights of military aircraft and naval vessels in waters and airspace near Taiwan. There's the indirect example of the cracking down of protests in Hong Kong. In addition, Beijing puts across its insistence, right, that any sort of effort that it pursues in terms of trying to bring Taiwan under its fold has to end up in this one country, two systems formula that it had originally rolled out in Hong Kong. And this comes under the so-called 1992 consensus. There's a bit of a debate over whether there really was a consensus, what it means, but I sidetracked a little. At any rate, what we also see, right, is that despite all this pressure, there's actually quite a limited effect on Taiwan preferences. Taiwan identification is strong, and it continues to grow. So if you look at the chart on the bottom of it's not too small. Essentially, if you look at that green line, it's it just increase. There's sort of it continues to increase. The sort of dark green line on top. Those are sort of the Taiwan identifications that continues to be really since the 1990s, the sort of dominant view that the Taiwanese hold of themselves. If you look at this idea of unification or not unification, essentially, this is the chart at the top. You have most people gravitate, that's about 80% of people gravitating towards the status quo in some form or the other. So status quo because there's recognition that a outright claim for independence, this is formal independence, it would invite a PRC use of force quite quickly. But there's that status quo also means that there's very little appetite for unification. And if you think about any active, robust democratic polity, to have something around 80% of agreement, it's really rare. So despite the pressure, this is what we're seeing. So I think that leads us to a few puzzles, right? Why is it that the sort of PRC coercive pressure on Taiwan seems so limited, right? And if you look at public opinion, it doesn't really seem to have very much an effect. It also opens up the question, so if coercion and all this sort of pressure doesn't get Taiwanese to change their minds, what do they prefer in terms of how they deal with the PRC in terms of their cross-strait relations? And there are obviously clear sort of implications and consequences for this, right? What the Taiwanese public prefers will affect the scope of what Taiwan governments can and cannot do. Taiwan, as I said, is a democracy. To the extent that its government can act, it has to act within the sort of acceptable range of public preferences, right? And also looking at the effects of PRC coercion on Taiwan, we can sort of tease out some of the effects that result from this sort of action. And I guess they're broader. If you're a political scientist, social scientist like myself, there are broader issues of conceptual consequence, right? And they are largely to look at this sort of signaling stuff about coercion. A lot of this coercive diplomacy is signaling, is trying to send signals of potential costs in order to change behavior. But a lot of that discussion tends to be very focused on elites, decision makers. There tends to be a little less focus, none less focus on public reactions and how those public reactions then hem in or encourage decision makers to behave in one way or the other. And this, for people who are interested in looking at audience cost argument, this is more of a policy kind of, a political science kind of debate, less a direct policy one. We're able to sort of understand a little bit more, I would hope, about audience costs. And I think what really comes across too is that when you look at public opinion responses to coercive signals, in comparison to elites who are, or decision makers who are, I guess, more of a cohesive group, although that can be debated, public audiences tend to be quite diverse. They see things differently. They can interpret the same signals differently. So we can look at some of these sorts of effects from this study, which I've engaged in with a couple of co-authors. This is Wenqing Wu and David Huang from the Academia Sinica in Taiwan. So there are a couple of hypotheses. I know in terms of people who look at foreign policy and strategy, there are much more nuanced ways of cutting into strategy, but because we are dealing with public opinion data, and I suppose you can make an argument that publics, they don't spend all that much time thinking about strategy and foreign policy. So it's a little bit simplified in terms of the responses we're able to gather. So essentially, It comes down to four different kinds of approaches that the public may prefer. One is isolation. You don't want to do anything. They essentially try to hide. There's balance, which is crudely to try to find other actors who can cooperate to create countervailing pressure on the source of coercion or the source of threat. There's bandwagoning, which is to work more closely with the threat in the hope of appeasing or mollifying those concerns. There's hedging, which is to try to work with both actors that could provide some countervailing pressure and also the main source of threat, with the hope that by trying to calibrate the two, you're able to navigate your way through. So those are the sort of four broad kinds of strategies that we in looking at the public opinion stuff seems to come out from what people have been asked and to think about. So from there, we have a couple of hypotheses, right? One is that citizens in a target country, they may be less likely to bandwagon with a coercing country if they perceive more threat from the coercer. So, trying to bandwagon, trying to work with the coercer, trying to hedge, right? You don't believe that will sufficiently address the concerns of the coercing state such that they will back off. So if that's the case, then bandwagoning becomes a less preferred strategy. A related hypothesis is that citizens in the target country, right, are more likely to balance with the coercing country by aligning. So they work against a coercing country by aligning with others if the threat from the coercer is really high. So not only do they not want to bandwagon, they want to work with others against the coercer. So those two are two related hypotheses. And the second hypothesis is that citizens in the target country are more likely to choose to hedge, right, when they perceive that the hostility between their own state and the coercing country is more moderate. So there is some room for negotiation. There's some room for compromise. If that is open, then this hedging becomes more of an option. And of course, if threats are even lower, then probably bandwagoning might become an option. So that's crudely the way that we try to conceptualize the choices, the options that are available to in this case the Taiwan public, but theoretically any other actor that is facing coercion. Okay. So what we do then is we look at the Taiwan National Security Survey. One of the good things about Taiwan is that they have a pretty open polity. There are many surveys, some of which are quite well done, and you can actually look at them and use them and get quite a lot of useful insights. So we look at three waves of the Taiwan National Security Survey, 2016, 2019, and 2020. We don't look at 2017 and 2018 because they actually didn't ask about this sort of strategy, so we couldn't use them. But these waves are useful anyway, because if you think about 2016, this is right after the election of Taiwan, where some of the coercions started. This continues throughout. In 2019, this is right when the survey was done, was just before the outbreak of the protests in Hong Kong, and this stepped up not only the crackdown in Hong Kong that came subsequently, but also the stepped up coercive measures against Taiwan, especially as we head into the 2020 election period. So 2020 captures a lot of that, so we're able to get some comparisons done. So in terms of the dependent variable, what we're trying to measure in terms of where the Taiwan public wants to go, we have a couple of questions in the Taiwan National Security Survey that gets us to look at that. One is this question that is asked whether there should be a strengthening of economic and trade relations with the PRC, and the other is whether there should be a strengthening of ties with the U.S. and Japan to counter the PRC, and whether there's support for it. So the way that it works is that if respondents say that they want neither, that falls into the isolation cell. If respondents say that they would rather strengthen ties with the PRC and not with the US and Japan, that falls into the bandwagoning cell. If respondents decide that they don't want to work with mainland China and would rather strengthen ties with US and Japan to counter, that's your balancing. If respondents say they want both, then that's your hedging response. And I mean, this sort of questioning, these questions allow us to dig into some of that dynamic. All right, so that's really how things look like. To give the game away, what we see is that isolation is not very much preferred, but if you look at what has changed, essentially bandwagoning starts in 2016 when perhaps perceptions of threat from China was not as high. It's always present, but it was not as high. It was the most preferred option, but that of course drops by 2020. There's a pretty clear trend. The sort of balancing option starts off actually as the third most preferred option. It becomes the preferred option by 2020. Hedging, the sort of middle of the road kind of approach, that remains middle of the road. But I think what is interesting to see here is that across this sort of period where PRC coercion is increasing, there's a increased desire from the Taiwan public to resist, right? So we try to understand why that is. Let me talk a little bit about the independent variables a little bit. So here we look at, again, based on the TNSS questions, right? We look at how people perceive threat and hostility from the PRC. So these are questions from the Taiwan National Security Survey. One is, if some say that Taiwan's economy relies too heavily on mainland China, then the mainland will use the economy to coerce Taiwan into making political concessions, right? So we look at the level of agreement, to the extent to which respondents feel that they agree with the statement. That suggests a higher level of threat, right? And of course the converse is true. And so there's also a separate question, which is perceptions of hostility. People are asked how hostile they think the PRC is, and there's a scale. And so we can look at that, and these inform I guess the choices we argue that the Taiwan public prefers. So what we actually see here is that this view that the PRC presents some sort of threat, that's pretty stable across the three waves. But this sense of hostility is what has really changed, right? You see this increased view that while the threat remains the same, there seems to be a view that the PRC is more willing to act on these threats. So hence the increase in the perceptions of hostility. Based on that, we sort of try to look then at the sort of trends. And what you see, obviously, is that for people who think that the threat, the level. Sorry, let me start with hostility first. So people who believe that the PRC is more hostile, the more the perceived hostility, the less likely you are to want to bandwagon. The more hostility you see, it's not a straight line, but generally the more hostility you see, the more you would prefer to balance. Now, for hedgers, there are folks who essentially at sort of they perceive the sort of middle level of hostility, and for those who prefer isolation, that the small group that prefers isolation essentially the hostility stuff doesn't have that much of an effect, except really in the first wave. If you look at this, the threat, right, this propensity of using economic coercion toward Taiwan, then again, you see similar patterns come about. You see those who perceive greater threat from the PRC preferring less bandwagoning, more balancing, and then for hedging, it's sort of hedging and isolation. It's sort of they sort of constant. So I guess what these data suggests is that the more the hostility, the more the threat, the more likely respondents, in this case in Taiwan, would prefer to balance against the PRC. So that's what we're seeing. We run several models with this, but it's essentially this really is just us running through and showing that we think our results are robust, right? And we sort of measure this across age, whether people are their partisan preferences, whether they are generally pro-independence or not, and you can see essentially that a lot comes down to this idea of economic coercion, hostility, and so on. So I guess this brings me to talk about some of the implications of our study. One is, of course, there's this increased preference for balancing, but what it also, I think, more interestingly suggests is that the PRC's efforts to coerce seems to be having the reversed effect. Clearly, people in Taiwan aren't going to go for independence now. That's very risky. They don't like that risk, but they do think that they need to find ways of countering what they see as increased pressure from the PRC. And this happens across multiple controls, as we had said earlier. And so what's interesting is rather than getting people to back down, coercion, especially coercion over long periods of time, actually fosters resistance, right? And there are these diminishing effects of coercion, as I suppose people get used to the pressure, they price it in, and they try to find a way out. So this is actually doesn't lead us to that sanguine a sort of conclusion, because what it means is that for the same effect of trying to pressure Taiwan by using coercive means, the PRC would, or any coercion, in fact, may have to find that they have to increase and up the ante every single time. So this creates actually a coercion and this sort of pricing in of coercion on the recipient end basically creates a dynamic where there's a real potential for escalation, right? And what this means is that maybe the way to address this is to think more creatively about deterrence, in order to sort of get the coercer to back down. Because in this case, the coercer is the one taking the initiative, right? And that might actually lead to a more stable situation, one that's less escalatory, where the risk of accidents might be lower. And the other thing that I think that's interesting is if you look at the public, there's not all one view, right? It's quite split, as all publics are. And that suggests that while the dynamics we talk about hold in general, the responses, people respond differently to pressure. People respond differently to coercion. There may be a general trend, but that convergence does take time. And I guess that speaks to the need to, when you're sending coercive signals, the need to really speak to different audiences, because what ends up happening is that the more you coerce, it seems that people who were previously more ambivalent shift over to become more willing to resist, right? So let me try to draw things to a close here. So what we are clearly looking at is we're moving into a tenser period of cross-strait ties. We see the frequency, the scale of PRC military activity and exercises near Taiwan increasing. And I suppose what this suggests is that because of the escalatory nature of using coercive tools, the maybe the way out is to think more creatively, to look at the possibilities for deterrence, right? Maybe that's the way to get actually more stability. And that, of course, isn't a silver bullet because deterrence, as many of you may know, involves both issuing both a credible threat and credible assurance. Because if you overly assure, of course, there's no reason the the coercer would need to back down. If you over coerce and you don't assure enough, then the coercer may feel more agitated. We get into this sort of security spiral, the security dilemma, when things can potentially become more unstable. So deterrence means getting things just right. But the problem with it is that in a dynamic situation where capabilities are changing, where political considerations are changing, that sort of Goldilocks area, that sweet spot of being just right is constantly shifting. So any efforts to deter have to adjust accordingly. So I suppose it's not so much about the sort of Taiwan resisting and standing up, right? But how to do it right, such that we avoid potential escalation and we reduce some of the risks that are across the Taiwan Strait. The other thing that I think is useful to look at is the lasting effects of this crackdown in Hong Kong. Beijing may have been able to quiet Hong Kong and control its society more than before, but that's come at the cost of the people on Taiwan seeing Beijing as more hostile, as being less trustworthy. So these sort of coercive moves, while they can get you some sort of effects, the idea of punishing one party to sort of signal to others, that can potentially have blowbacks as well. And now what we're seeing, of course, is with the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, there is, that further fuels this need, this perception in Taiwan of a need to prepare. So you see this picture on the right. That's basically Taiwan civilians trying to learn about civil defense, right? What to do in the case of an attack and things like that. That is a demonstration of some of the sort of the people, the general public, putting into practice and sort of realizing this sort of desire to stand up and to resist. So it's quite visible in Taiwan society today. All right, so that is sums up my formal presentation bit. It's I think about half an hour, so I'm happy to take your questions going forward. Let me just stop sharing for now, and I guess Bill will want to come back on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It's fantastic talk that I think really showcases exactly this intersection between domestic politics and public opinion, and analysis of electoral politics and political discourse inside Taiwan with international relations, and thinking about how we can think of how different factions of the public are actually adopting different international relations stances and preferences, and the interplay between the two. I thought that was absolutely brilliant on that score. And so let me remind the audience that you can submit questions. Please do submit questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. As the audience members formulate their questions, though, I've got a few, because I was really sparked to have a number of thoughts by this. The first that I'll ask is just very basically, how generalizable do you think this really is, in the sense that Taiwan is unique in the structural position in which it finds itself, right? There are very few other places that are under that degree of coercive pressure and threat from that large an adversary that constantly for such a long time. And so, yes, the degree and intensity of the coercion and the threat can go up and can go down, and has indeed over a long time, but it's never gone, right? And so that plus the fact that such a high percentage of people have served in the military, and people are generally not necessarily obsessed with thinking about the mainland and cross-straits issue, but they're certainly very well informed about it from an early age. It's very hard to grow up in Taiwan and not be sort of inculcated with a lot of information about this and ideas, and to have thought about it at least somewhat. So how much does all of that make Taiwan a special case? And how much do you think we can generalize this to other kinds of cases where we might see a similar dynamic?
So I think where we can generalize this is for entities that face long-term pressure from perhaps some rival, especially some large rival. So there is where I think we can probably speak. Well, the results seem to speak best to, because you have this sort of threat in your face all the time, and as it increases, right, there isn't this sort of capitulation, right? So I think those cases we are able to capture. What I think is a bit different with is for cases where the coercion is rather sudden and unexpected. So that's where I think the response may be because there's less certainty about the intentions of the coercer, that it may lead to more of a sense of, okay, maybe there's something we can do to sort of back down a little bit, to seek some kind of compromise. I think those cases are a bit different. So I think that really comes down to the scope conditions. And I guess, beyond that, the sort of bits about, as you mentioned, people on Taiwan thinking about the PRC and all that. Yes, I mean, I think that is true to a certain extent, but I won't push it that far, because if you look at, say, local elections, those people respond to a variety of things. The PRC isn't the only thing people care about. They also care about healthcare. They care about how the economy is doing. I mean, these things matter as well. But I think what the coercion bit does is that it heightens this need to address, it makes what might not be the most pressing problem into the most pressing problem. So I think that bit is quite interesting to look at. And the military side, I just want to say, for Taiwan, they also had this very fraught relationship. The society has this very fraught relationship with the military because of the White Terror, the sort of martial law period, where the military was used as a tool, right, to repress. So that cuts both ways, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's well, and it would be very interesting then actually to try to assess which subgroups in Taiwan society are affected how by the military, right? If you're Bensheng or Waisheng, and if you're in the north or the south, or if you have family members with long military service or not, or if you're just a conscript, how does military service affect your opinion? I mean, I think that would be a very interesting thing to sort out.
And class.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So another question that I had, and then I'll get to the audience questions in a minute, on the deterrence angle. I thought that was really interesting as a potential response, but then I sort of felt myself left wondering, who's doing the deterring, right? Is Taiwan really in a position to deter China? Or would this have to rely on other countries acting as sort of partners with Taiwan? And I'm assuming the US and or Japan would be key countries in doing that. And then how much of that depends on who's in power in those countries and how reliable they are as deterrence partners and so forth.
Right. So that's absolutely right. I think the intuition for people on Taiwan is to look at the US and Japan as, but this is the balancing bit, right? They think they're good partners for deterring more coercion and perhaps the use of force from the PRC. Now, that's one way. That's one way to look at it. And this is what in IR we call external balancing. We look for outside partners. There's also this element of internal balancing, which is a little bit, which the dynamic's slightly different, but it also operates in Taiwan, which is that you essentially build up your own capabilities. So I guess the point of deterrence when you look at internal balancing in Taiwan, and this is why they do things like the submarines and all that they just, the first one was just launched for sea trials today.
Yeah.
They do that because the belief is you may not win But if you can get into your potential opponent's head that any use of force could be potentially very costly. So even if you had a victory, it'd be a very costly victory. That might discourage, more risky behavior. So that's the sort of internal aspect of it. And I think where Taiwan's public, it's not in this particular study, but it is in some other stuff that I looked at. Historically, Taiwan, because of that very ambivalent relationship with the military, the Taiwan public had been very reluctant to give more budget to the military despite this threat. That's been a pretty long-standing issue since the 90s. But within this time period that we look at, actually, or even slightly before, the Taiwan public has been a lot more willing to put money from that could go into other kinds of uses toward defense. So that submarine thing is an example. It's a massively expensive project. Before, I think you have the public resisting. They get basically get the legislators to try to stop it. But in this case, yes, there was some resistance, but by and large, the budget went through. And I think that reflects one of these effects, right, of this continued and increasing coercive pressure from Beijing.
Great. Now let's turn to some audience questions. So we've got one audience member who's posed two questions. The first is, how is news of coercive measures presented to the Taiwanese public? Do different media outlets and sources in Taiwan present and interpret them in distinct ways, or give, I imagine, different spins to what the coercion might mean? And the second question that this person has is, what's the longer history of PRC economic coercion on the global stage? Is there some particular reason why it seems to be a favored tool of the Chinese state, at least according to this questioner, who says that they're thinking about Lithuania, Australia, and other cases like that?
Yeah, that's those two are great questions. If they don't go in the same direction, I'll try to address them. One is the observation of threat is similar. So the various media outlets, the politicians, they all talk about it. No one denies that there's some activity going on. But the interpretation, this is where the spin comes in, will change. So there are some, I think, who are more Beijing friendly, who say, well, look, this just shows that Beijing is getting really upset, and you want to be want to have a gentler approach, right? That will get them to back down. So this would be the bandwagoning people who I talked about. So they'll spin things that way. There'll be others who say, well, this sort of threat means that we have to resist. So this is your people who just want the balancing bit. There are others who will claim that we want a bit of both. So the way that it's spun Taiwan has a very diverse and pluralistic media scene, and so you have spins going in various directions. So I guess where the public sort of lands on is after well, some people obviously they just go for their favorite source, but I think in the aggregate, people sort of look at what's out there and gravitate to what they prefer. The other thing about economic coercion, this is actually a really interesting question, because from the outside we see that, well, this sudden stoppage of imports or export of certain minerals. This was with Japan before. We call it economic coercion, but the PRC they use it, but they actually, except I think in the case of Australia, I think Lithuania, they were less direct in how they couched it. So one example was with the Japanese and the rare earths, right? That was couched as, inspections had to go on. And we saw the case of salmon for Norway, and there was quarantine reasons. And I think recently, I mean, with Taiwan, a lot of it was also for health inspection kinds of reasons. So yes, they use economic coercion, but they try to also package it in a particular way. It's hard to get at what people in Beijing, I think perhaps they're doing it to get around WTO kinds of retaliation, reasons for retaliation, but at least that's the packaging. And I suppose China uses its economic leverage because it is an area where it has advantage, and it may believe that it's an area where the potential for escalation may be a bit lower. Many major powers do this as well. This is, if you look at the US, it uses sanctions quite a lot. Essentially, it's the same thing. Right. So yeah, I think that's the view, that you can control the level of escalation is probably why, my guess.
I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing, just as an aside, that springs to mind, listening to you answer those particular questions, is also the degree of convergence that you noted in the talk in terms of some of the baseline policy preferences of the Taiwanese public. I mean, if I think back, 30 years ago almost, when I was a student in Taiwan, during the some of the first rounds of the open democratic elections there was a much sharper polarization, I think, of opinion about the cross-straits issues, right? I
Mhm.
mean, there were significant factions of people in multiple political parties who were advocating either immediate formal declaration of independence or reunification. And I think at this point, very few people in any political parties are openly advocating either of those positions. At least they're not getting
Right,
very many votes or supporters if they are.
right,
Whereas people really have converged to this remarkable extent towards the middle ground. Um,
right.
so in that sense, it's harder to split the public about the nature of coercion and maybe what the best outcome might be of the scenario. So I think that there's probably more unity on that than was the case before, than maybe is normal, not normal, but is common in these kinds of scenarios of coercion. Right?
Right. I think there's still a lot of vocal people on either side,
Mm,
on either extremes. But the public in general, I think they've settled to this on this sort of idea that okay, things are okay for now. In fact, they may be pretty good. Why
mm,
change things?
exactly. Another audience question is with regards to where Taiwanese identification is strong. What is it about Taiwanese nationalism that makes it strong, and how does this differ from the PRC in terms of identity? What are the semiotic representations and conceptual understandings that are strong for Taiwanese people?
All right. So actually, this is quite interesting. It goes to actually another piece of work that I've done. Um, So essentially, if you ask Taiwan people in Taiwan, what is it that makes you Taiwanese? Why do you care? What do you care about as a Taiwanese person? Um, Essentially, what becomes clear is that people care a lot about having a democratic system, because they believe that the system um, that is open enough allows them to have enough voice opportunities and maybe even have some sort of indirect effect in terms of shaping policy, and is responsive to them, is one that they're a lot more accustomed to, they're a lot more comfortable with it, and they prefer it to any other alternative. This is reinforced in the Taiwan case, I think, by their history of struggle against authoritarian rule. So having been under authoritarian rule, I think the sort of social memory, at least, not necessarily individual memories, but the social memory of having less representation, having a more repressive system is still very strong, and that's something that people really want to avoid. Hence, I think why that response to the crackdown in Hong Kong was so strong.
Mm,
They see that as a move towards authoritarianism. They see that as Beijing not holding to its promises. So they figure, well, given that we fought for the democratization and we have a system that we like now, why would we want to go back to that other system, more repressive system? So I think that's quite key, and that's more important than say ideas about ethnicity necessarily. I mean, there's this whole speaking Taiwanese thing. I mean, I think it's stronger than that, because one of the directions in which Taiwan society is going now is they're talking about, well, they want to or aspire to be a pluralistic society where they have more space for their Aboriginals, where they allow for more integration of people who come from mixed marriages, and also naturalized tongues. They still have a long way to go, but at least those intentions seem to be present.
right. Another audience question. There's a lot of really good questions here, actually. Another question asks, how might the upcoming presidential election in the United States affect the Taiwanese public preference towards alliance or partnership with the United States? Could a Republican victory, for example, induce more isolationist tendencies among the Taiwanese public? I guess because they might see the U.S. as a less reliable or steadfast partner in that case.
Right. Actually, this is also a really good question that we saw if a Republican victory happens in the next U.S. presidential election, it'll be a rerun of what we saw in the Trump years, right? There was initially a lot of trepidation, um, about Trump, making these statements about how he would just make some deal with the PRC. Then he shifted to being very hawkish, and I think that was actually quite divisive.
Mhm.
Um, because some in the Taiwan public figured that, okay, well, maybe this strong, strident US tone is what will keep Beijing at bay. Others figured, well, this could be overly provocative. Now, this sort of dynamic is not unique to Taiwan. I mean, when we look at alliance politics, right, this stuff about entrapment and abandonment is a constant feature, right? Whether your ally will decide that, okay, they're going to go and do their own thing and they don't live up to whatever commitments they've made, or that your ally becomes so overly active they drag you into some adventure that you really want to avoid. So in that respect, Taiwan is not different. They are subject to those dynamics as well. And I guess what we'll see is probably with a Republican victory, if it looks anything like the past Trump presidency, it will probably create a lot more divisiveness. And people in Taiwan have to figure out, depending on the U.S. policy, how closely they want to be aligned, how much they think they can be relied on. But just a small aside here, one of the before there used to be a lot less reliance on Japan. But with the Trump presidency, what you saw was Tokyo stepped up. They figured that they had to be more responsible for their own region. And that also got the Taiwanese to look at them as a more serious partner. So there's that other dynamic to watch too.
Right. Here's a question actually that speaks to kind of tension between internal and external balancing, at least the way I read it. But the question from the audience is, this person also has two questions. First is, do you think that TSMC's move to build capacity in the United States could be considered as a reaction to the coercion from Beijing? How could it impact the relationship between the two sides over the long term? And the second question is, considering the Russia-Ukraine war, is NATO also trying to aggravate the Taiwan problem or to fabricate a kind of coercion through media? In other words, to play up the problem in order to make the perception worse?
Okay, so with the first one, the TSMC, firstly, it's a private firm, so it has commercial decisions. And I think primarily what was driving the TSMC's decision to relocate some of its operations to the US was basically because the US was talking about onshoring. And if TSMC wanted to get around those restrictions, they would have to open a factory there. Plus, I think by creating a US subsidiary, essentially a U.S. entity, they would also be able to tap into some of the subsidies that the U.S. government would be giving for this onshoring. So I think those commercial decisions are considerations are quite important, and at the same time, I think for TSMC, like many other companies that are outside China, they are also looking at diversification strategies, and this is one of them. That bit is related to the PRC coercion. So I guess the sort of net answer is yes. I think PRC coercion is one of the considerations, but I don't think it's the primary one. So NATO trying to aggravate the Taiwan problem. I'm not sure that this is something that NATO is actively thinking about. I mean, NATO seems very much focused on the Ukraine problem, the problem of Russia and invading Ukraine, and they're just doing that. And whatever people in Taiwan are reading, they're just looking at what's happening in Europe, and they figure, well, it's there's some people who figure that, okay, well, if we want to avoid this, then you have to accommodate Beijing. But by and large, I think the majority of people think that, okay, if we want to avoid this, then we have to be more serious about our own defense, which speaks to that willingness I mentioned earlier about shifting shifting money, dollars or new Taiwan dollars towards defense as opposed to other spending areas.
Right, absolutely. And then another question from the audience we have regarding an attempt potentially to blockade Taiwan. First, is this actually a realistic possibility or policy option for the mainland? And then second, even if we say that it isn't realistic for China to blockade Taiwan, is even this idea or suggestion that may occur or that they may attempt it, is that actually a form of coercion that Taiwan has to consider when thinking about its preferred strategy or reactions?
Right. So, firstly, a blockade would be a coercive move. So, coercion move, they're everything from just saber rattling, to actually using force. That the whole range of things you could do. I'm just looking at sort of the mid range of that, just short of actual use of violence, right? Um, so a blockade is certainly on the cards. That's possible. But that's also why you see Taiwan talk about some of the asymmetric approaches. This is actually why the submarines are there. They're essentially to break blockades, right? Um, and so that's in effect a way to think about how you want to deter. You want to show your potential adversary that, oh, if you're going to try to blockade, it's going to cost you. That's the point. And I suppose that that then gets into this whole balancing thing. You want to work with the U.S. and Japan to break the blockade because the U.S. is very much invested in stability in Asia, and Japan is as well. And here is also a point that I want to sort of zoom out a little bit. Sometimes people think about any Taiwan crisis in isolation. It's not. Because if you think about the sea lanes, the air routes, and also the submarine cables that go around Taiwan, if there's a blockade, if there's a crisis around Taiwan, then you're essentially affecting trade, communications, travel between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. So your South Korea and your Japan would become very quickly interested in the issue because their own economic lifelines would be at stake. And not least because a lot of their energy imports come through Southeast Asia, South China Sea, and they want to protect those. And for Southeast Asian states, Japan and South Korea, China is very important economically, but so are these other places, and Japan in particular because of investment. So any blockade in Taiwan would there's the potential for escalation and getting other actors involved may not be through the use of force, but it would create a very big mess, I think, regionally, and that's important to remember.
Remember, there's also a non-trivial diaspora population in Taiwan of people from Japan, but also especially from places like the Philippines,
Oh,
Thailand,
absolutely.
Indonesia, etc. So there are significant diasporas there from both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, who
Right.
would be directly affected by blockade or increase in tensions that impacts daily life.
Just let me quickly add one point to that. So, one thing we saw with the Philippines is that after the series of exercises, after the Pelosi visit last August, they started becoming a lot more serious about defense. They started
Yeah.
becoming a lot more serious and working with the US because the signal that they got was, you know what, we won't be able to sit out a Taiwan contingency.
Mhm.
We may not want to side wing, we don't want to provoke anything, but we want to make sure that if the chips fall that way, we are able to protect our own equities.
Exactly. I mean, the Philippines is so close geographically to the situation, as is
Right.
Japan on the other side. It's really
Right.
not a long way, just across the sea to where it does directly impact sovereignty issues for those states. Okay, another question. Actually, this one is very similar to the last one. It just says, how does Taiwan's semiconductor industry affect the economic relationship? It's kind of similar to the TSMC question, but if you wanted to elaborate in a broader sense on this at all.
Oh, so there's this trope in Taiwan saying that well TSMC and the larger semiconductor industry as 护国神山 as the sort of
Mm,
sacred mountain that will protect the island. I mean, people say it half in jest. I think there is uh, some logic to it in the sense that because of some of the really high end production of semiconductors in Taiwan, uh, if there is a crisis, it would affect global supply chains, probably in a way that's worse than what we saw during COVID. So that gives other actors a stake in making sure that there's stability and perhaps even that there isn't a unilateral change to the status quo. So the semiconductor element is there. But that's more for other actors. I don't think the semiconductor bit matters that much for the PRC. So some people claim that, oh, because of the semiconductors, the PRC won't attack. I think if the PRC decided that it needed to really put pressure on Taiwan, it really needed to escalate, then it's taking a very big risk. And for it to take that level of risk, it means that things like semiconductors and supply chains probably aren't that important anymore. But it would be still important for other actors.
Here's a last question from the audience, which actually is one that always comes up in my mind whenever I think about this, or especially if I ever talk to, for example, Democratic Progressive Party politicians or other sort of non-KMT politicians in particular. But this question is, do you have more specific ideas of where exactly PRC coercion ranks in voters' concerns compared to, say, the economy or healthcare and health insurance system or pensions, for example, given what's happened over the last administration? Would you say that the cross-straits issue or PRC coercion is a kingmaker in elections, or is it really more of a secondary concern where all these other social issues and other policy issues are in fact more important?
So I think it is probably usually consistently within the top five, top 10, if not top five concerns, but it's highly dynamic because it's a matter of whether voters start thinking about PRC coercion. And in the past, what we've seen is when during the election period, the PRC sends missiles, makes it so this is 95, 96, makes an overt threat. This is 2000 with Zhurongji. Then the public tends to react very much quite strongly against that kind of pressure. I think there's a bit of a rally around the flag effect. And I suppose this is why the DPP tries to often talk up the PRC threat. At times when this is the Maingzhou election of 2008, where things seem a bit calmer, then people are concerned about other things, right? Economic liberalization, fixing, improving the healthcare system and things like that. So that I think was the case with the 2008 and 2012 elections, until the Ma people, I think, overplayed their hand. They started talking about liberalizing labor and letting free labor. I think that really alarmed a lot of people, even before that's why you had the sunflower movement, but that's even before the coercion stuff kicked in. So when you look at the 2016, there was, I think, that after the sunflower movement, the PRC decided to cut off some of the tourism and some of the fruit and vegetable exports from Taiwan to China. So that's when you see the coercion starting. Of course, 2019 was the Hong Kong stuff. 2020 was the Hong Kong stuff. So, in sum, I think a lot of it will come down to whether the PRC is confident enough of itself to just just lay low, lean back, and let things happen. To the extent they're able to do that, then I think the cross-strait issues become less of a concern, and relations across the strait may actually get better. But to the extent that leaders in Beijing feel uneasy about the preferences of Taiwan voters and decide that they need to add pressure, that's when things get very messy for them.
Great. That's pretty much everything from our audience. There's one other question that I would just pose, just sort of circling all the way back to the beginning about sort of trying to generalize to other cases, which is about sort of data comparability. The Taiwan National Security Survey seems really kind of special and unique in some ways, that there aren't a lot of countries that do that. to that degree, with all these different sorts of questions, pulling out all of the different angles on this in a high quality survey. But that may not be the case. I mean, I could imagine similar surveys happening, for example, in South Korea or in Israel or in a number of other countries that maybe you could argue face similar kinds of coercive threats at different points in history. Are there such surveys? Have you looked at that? Have you thought about sort of how you could perhaps generalize up, or is it really not something that's
So,
feasible?
right. So to generalize this, I think what you probably would need to do is to actually run a survey, the same survey across different cases, different polities, that then you can make it comparable. But that's not been done yet. I mean, there are obviously surveys, similar kinds of surveys, I think in South Korea and Israel. I'm less sure. But of course, the questions that are asked may not be completely comparable and things like that. So you probably, if it were a research project, then you would have to run these surveys across different polities, asking the same kinds of questions, using the same kinds of controls and all that.
One other question just came in actually from the audience tab, which I think is a really good one. So I'll ask you that before letting you off the hook, even though I know it's already getting to be quite late at night. So thank you very much for sticking with us and staying up so late. But
oh, the night is young for me.
Okay, yeah, it is after 11 though. It's actually 10, right? Because
10.
we're in summertime here, so it's not as bad as I thought. So this question, I'll rephrase slightly, but I'll ask it as the audience member has posed it first, which is, what is the current position of ASEAN on Taiwan and potential PRC escalating coercion? And I might rephrase that very slightly just to say, my intuition is that ASEAN wouldn't have a very strong position, that there'd be a split within ASEAN. So are there particular ASEAN member states that might have stakes in this, or particular positions, or ASEAN as a whole, if you wanted to stick with the original formulation?
Yeah, I can actually speak quite quickly to both. So after the Pelosi visit and all the escalation that was that surrounded, that came after it, ASEAN, surprisingly, to my surprise too, actually, issued a statement. But that statement, we read it's quite funny. It's funny because the statement talked about the tensions across the street. They never mentioned which strait. And they asked
it could be the Straits of
parties
Sunda,
to. It could be the Straits of Sunda. It could be, I don't know, maybe it's Gibraltar,
Yeah.
But at any rate, they never mentioned which strait. And they talked about all parties exercising restraint without naming which parties were there. But that's, I think, reflective of, as a whole, the ASEAN position, which is they really don't want a crisis. They really don't want escalation. They don't want any unilateral change to the status quo. But as a whole, they are also really scared of ticking off Beijing. Now, this gets to the other bit of your question, Bill. So I think that's the aggregate position, but every country, will be quite different on where they stand. So I think the Philippines, because of the diaspora, because of proximity, they figured, and also because they have this ongoing and escalating territorial dispute with the PRC, they probably figured, well, there's nowhere we can go. So we might as well come up with a stronger position, which is what they've done. And if you look at the case of Thailand, I mean, their domestic politics notwithstanding, so for them to have a clear foreign policy is very difficult. But I think they would much rather not upset Beijing. I think you can make a similar case for Malaysia, also because of their domestic politics. Singapore, too. I think Singapore is very ambivalent about this. They would rather not be a problem, but they are quite torn between their ties with the US and Japan. And Australia also, but
and a non-trivial relationship with Taiwan too, in terms of trade.
Right. Oh yeah, so Taiwan is I think the fourth largest trading partner. So
exactly.
And it's also like it's a big investor too. So there's that. And Indonesia, as you know, is completely different because they've got their active dan bebas, free and active policy, where they think that they can be a mover and shaker. And maybe they're right. So they would be more active in terms of, trying to, shift their weight in different directions in order to try to really affect how the regional dynamics work. So different ASEAN countries are quite different, but in the aggregate, you get that very cautious ASEAN position. And I think the Vietnam position is probably worth mentioning too, because like Indonesia, Vietnam has a diaspora population in Taiwan,
Yeah.
but for them, it's always about how do you be just tough enough with the PRC without crossing the line, because you want to satisfy the fact that you have your own nationals in Vietnam, you have your territorial disputes, but if you get into a big fight with the PRC, even if you're lucky enough to sort of come out on top, it's going to be very, very costly. So, the different ASEAN states look at these things very, very differently. I know there's a lot of talk about ASEAN centrality and unity, but those I think are very aspirational. It's a lot more will come down to these individual countries and how they decide they want to look at the situation in Taiwan and with the PRC.
I wonder if some of it is even based on geographic proximity plus sort of military expenditures. So, a place like Vietnam is next to China, and I believe Vietnamese military expenditures is a very large percentage of the overall ASEAN military expenditure. I mean, they're spending significantly more than almost any other ASEAN state on defense. And so in that sense, they might have one position. The Philippines is also right next to China, but much less sort of defense ready in that sense, or a big defense spender. Indonesia is not a big defense spender and is really far away compared to Philippines or Vietnam. So in that sense, there might be sort of different optimal strategies depending on that constellation of factors too.
There's another factor. It's geographical, but it's not necessarily proximity. So when you have a Taiwan Strait crisis, Singapore will be a transit point. The U.S. tends to use it historically, it's used it to move military assets from points east to points west. And you can see the reverse happening in a crisis. So the PRC knows this as well. So there will be a lot of political pressure on the Singapore government. But it's not just going to be Singapore. To get to Singapore, you have to cross Malaysian and Indonesian airspace and waters. So that same dynamic will also play out for Indonesia and Malaysia. The Indonesians were quite interesting because I think last year, right after the crisis, they initially figured they wanted nothing to do with it. Then they say, okay, if there's a crisis, what they might do is they'll close off their archipelagic waters to military vessels. And then they realized that they couldn't do that under UNCLOS, and then that quietly went away. And so they're left still figuring what to do. If they allow transit, they might become then a target for the PRC. If they don't allow transit, then they could easily arouse the ire of the Americans. So for them, it's not an easy proposition either.
No, that's absolutely right. And then, of course, that also throws up this whole issue of Indonesian Navy has been unable even to ensure that they can crack down on things like illegal fishing here and there around bits of the archipelago. Massive numbers of military ships transiting. They shouldn't be cracking down, as you point out correctly, under the Convention on the Law of the Sea. But even if not for that, they probably don't have the capability even to think about enforcing a ban on transits or something like this.
Right. So not right now. That's something that I think the Indonesians are thinking about building up. So they've been more vocal in terms of their military build. They've been trying to get more sophisticated hardware. Some of it around the Natunas, which is in this sort of quasi disputed area. It's very gray. And they've not been happy in the past when they fished out these undersea gliders that purportedly came from the PRC that was surveying their waters. So the incentives are very much mixed in Indonesia too.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that pretty much does it for the audience questions, and I don't have any more questions for you at this point. Let me just give you a chance if you wanted to say anything else in closing or speak back to any points that have already been raised.
So I guess the only real point that I want to make here is I think if we, I mean, I looked at Taiwan as a case. It's also a case I know well, but we are in a situation where threats of force at varying levels are becoming more frequent again. And so I think, looking at how force is used, how coercion is used, how tools of economic statecraft are used, and the potential for escalation and the responses is probably going to be something that is worth thinking about, whether you're looking at Asia or elsewhere. I mean, unfortunately, that's the situation we are all in right now, and hence that research.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I'm sure the audience also joins in thanking me. Almost all our audience members have stayed on until the end. So that's thank you, audience, for doing so. Thank you again for a great talk. And for those of you watching online, please do follow the center on social media and on our website, and look for recordings of this talk and others on our YouTube channel now and in the future. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to everyone in the audience. And good night, good afternoon, good morning to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.